Well, good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all today to our conversation about Turkish public opinion on foreign and security policy. We have a very active program of work on Turkey, and one of the key pieces of that is the work done by my colleague here in Brussels, Kadri Taştan, who's our senior fellow under the program that we do in partnership with the Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchanges of Turkey, TOBB. This program today is in his program, but it also it builds on work that was done from a recent survey on polarization in Turkey that was conducted as part of a project that we conducted with from our Ankara office, but in cooperation with Istanbul Bilgi University and also with support from the Swedish International Development Agency. And we're very, very thankful to both of them for their partnership in this work. We're going to be able to talk about maybe one aspect of that today, but also I think an issue or an aspect of Turkish foreign policy that's become more important in recent years and really now plays a very critical role in Turkey's relationship with the United States, with Europe, and in its regional policy. And we'll have a chance to hear more about that. We have a few wonderful people with us today to talk about this. I'll let our moderator, Kadri, introduce them in a moment, but just to say we're always very pleased to have both colleagues and friends together at GMF events, and that's certainly what we have today. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and over to you, Kadri.
Thank you, Ian. Hello, everyone, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this discussion on Turkish public opinion on foreign policy and security. It's my great pleasure to moderate this discussion. My name is Kadri Taştan. I am a GMF-TOBB senior fellow with the GMF here in Brussels. Well, as Ian has already mentioned, the recent GMF and the Bilgi University survey on polarization in Turkey demonstrate the highly polarized nature of Turkish society, but also really interesting results on the foreign policy issues. When my colleague will present the result, you will see that in a highly polarized Turkey, the foreign policy represents largely an island of agreement. But today, we won't present you all the result of the survey. My colleagues have already presented the result during two other webinars. Today, with my distinguished guests, we will focus on the foreign policy issues, such as whether to take military action versus reliance on diplomacy, relations with the allies, NATO, source of threat, and the EU accession process, etc. We will analyze the Turkish public opinion on these issues and its potential impact on the Turkey's orientation in the foreseeable future. So for this, we have a really great panel. Please let me first to introduce my guests. We have Nicholas Danforth. Nick is based in Washington, but he's a non-resident senior research fellow with the ELIAMEP in Athens. Then we have Dorothée Schmid with us. Dorothée is a senior research fellow and also head of Turkey and Middle East program at IFRI in Paris. And last but not the least, we have my colleague Özgür, Ünlühisarcıklı, GMF Ankara office director. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. Well, first of all, I will give the floor to my colleague Özgür to present us some technical details and methodology about the survey and the results on the foreign policy issues. And after Özgür's presentation, I will ask some questions to our three speakers and have a conversation with them. Then, of course, we will open up to all of you. So just to say that is on the record, and if you would like to put a question, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we will keep track them and we will get as many of you as we can. Please specify also to whom you are asking your question. Özgür, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kadri. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is attending. Before actually starting to share some of the results of the survey on foreign policy, I would like to say a few words about what public opinion means for actual foreign policy. Public opinion is actually only one of the drivers of a country's foreign policy, together with assessment of national interests of the ruling elite, ideational factors, the international system, and the list could continue. And as a matter of fact, until recently, public opinion was, I believe, not even among the most significant drivers of foreign policy. But with the increasing availability of information and communication thanks to internet and social media, the importance of public opinion on policy is increasing, not only in Turkey, but in all contexts. So I believe this is a very good opportunity to discuss Turkish public opinion on foreign policy when Turkey followers in different countries are trying to make sense of what's driving Turkish foreign policy at this time. I will now share my screen with you. This is the first time I'm doing it, so apologies in advance if I make any mistakes, but yes, I didn't. Okay, so I first want to talk about the initial survey, which was Dimensions of Polarization in Turkey survey 2020. This survey was conducted with 4,000 respondents representing adult population of Turkey in 20 cities, in 29 cities. I'm emphasizing this because nowadays most surveys in Turkey are conducted by phone interviews, which is not the best technique you can use. And with 1,000 or 1,200 respondents, this is one of the biggest and most reliable surveys that has been conducted in Turkey during the last couple of years, if not the last decade. Here you see the participant demographics, which are actually in line with the demographics that are published by the State Statistics Bureau. This is a quality control mechanism that we are using. And if you are actually interested more on the polarization aspect of the survey or the survey as a whole, I encourage you to go to this website that you see at the top, turkuazlab.org. So the turquoise does not represent the color, but in Turkish, the project's name is Türkiye'de kutuplaşmayı azaltma, so it's an abbreviation. But if you could note that down, you could see actually the whole findings of the survey. So back to for the findings on foreign policy. This is, of course, not a survey on foreign policy. So there are questions that we have not asked, which we would have asked were this survey focusing on foreign policy. I will start with Turkey's chosen trauma and explain what it is. First, Vahmik Volkan, a Cypriot Turkish political psychologist, actually has coined the term chosen trauma and defined it as an injury inflicted upon a large group by an enemy group, as a result of which the victimized group has experienced losses, shame, and humiliation. And he goes on, if the chosen trauma is not healed by a mourning process, it becomes a significant marker for the large group identity. In Turkey's case, actually the chosen trauma happens to be the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and furthermore, the division of mainland Turkey into several parts. So the map that you see at the bottom on the right is vivid on the eyes of all educated Turks, because we are taught this over and over in school. So the yellow part that you see, which also includes Ankara, would be left to the Ottoman Empire, and all of the rest would be French mandate, zone of Straits, Italian zone, British mandate, etc., which did not happen, but which still is vivid. And as a matter of fact, contrary to what Vahmik Volkan has said, Turkey has not gone through a healing process. So this map actually happens to define our identity. And on the left, you see the picture of the first page of an On Turkey series piece we had published a couple of years ago, named The Unbearable Heaviness of Being a Turkish Citizen by Professor Emre Erdoğan. I actually encourage you to go to the GMF website to read this. It is very interesting, and it actually explains Turkey's chosen trauma, and this is also called the Sevr syndrome generally. So what do Turkish citizens generally think about where the world is going, the big picture? So first of all, Turks, as you see here, the blue lines represent people who agree that there will be more than one dominant country in the future. So Turkish citizens, as I believe the Turkish government also does, already live in a post-American reality. It is not the case yet, at least yet, but already Turkish citizens are living in such a reality. They think that China and Russia will increase their power against the United States. So not only China, but they think that Russia will also increase its power against the United States. They believe that international solidarity and cooperation, they don't believe that international solidarity and cooperation will increase in the future. So they're pessimistic about international cooperation. And here, let me also talk to you a little bit about the structure of the charts. You also see the differences among parties. I will stop and talk about the differences among the parties when actually I think it's important. But so far, actually, voters of different parties think almost along the same lines. They don't have, well, they think that international organizations will become dysfunctional in the future. And there's not significant difference among voters of different parties. They think that countries will become inward-looking and concerned with their own citizens' interests in the future. And by the way, I mean, I would agree with the general public opinion on a number of these issues. Then we come to trust in international institutions. I must say that according to World Values Survey, first of all, generalized trust level in Turkey is one of the lowest in the world. At some point, we were the second worst country in terms of trusting others. And this other does not need to be a foreigner. The question is, do you choose to trust someone who is not a family member or a close friend? And Turks generally say no. So if we don't even trust each other in Turkey, do we trust international organizations? No. So you see the red bars are people who do not trust the European Union, who do not trust the United Nations, who do not trust NATO, who do not trust the World Health Organization. And you see that actually the World Health Organization is the least distrusted, possibly not because it deserves to be least distrusted, but possibly because it's not a political organization anyway. Then we come to conspiracy theories. We actually had several questions on conspiracy theories, but I just picked one for the sake of saving time. So events that seem not related are mostly the outcome of covert acts. So, you know, this is a typical conspiracy theory question. And you see that all party voters are more or less equal to each other, and they more or less believe in this conspiracy theory as they do to others. Now, when we look at this not from a party perspective, but from a generational perspective, we can see that actually, at least in the case in Turkey, this could be a general worldwide trend, but at least in the case of Turkey, younger people are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories, possibly because of the time that they're spending on the internet as opposed to older people. So, I mean, we usually think that once the younger generation becomes more influential, everything will be resolved. At least in this case, we could not say that. Now, there are some very interesting questions on war and diplomacy. This is very relevant and timely because Turkey has been in a number of low-intensity battles during the last couple of years. Let's see why the Turkish government has chosen this approach. This is a typical, well, this is not a typical question. This is about Turkey. Turkey might use military force outside of the country when it is necessary to protect its interests in the international arena. So there are, first of all, differences among different parties here. Generally, so the blue bars are those that agree, the red bars are those that disagree. And you see that actually the voters of the parties of the governing alliance, the AK party and MHP, largely agree about this. The others actually slightly disagree, like CHP voters actually significantly disagree that this is okay. Or let's say, where is HDP voters? HDP voters disagree. Now, good party voters, it's an interesting case. So good party is a nationalist party. Ideologically, its ideological origins is not too different from MHP. It's actually, it's a breakaway party from the MHP, although other voting groups also joined the party later, but they disagree. So this tells us something. As much as voter behavior or public opinion impacts policies of parties or governments, actually policies of governments and parties also impact what their voters, members, or citizens think about foreign policy issues. So it's not only Turkish public opinion that impacts how the Turkish government conducts foreign policy, but how the Turkish government chooses to conduct foreign policy also impacts what Turkish citizens think about this issue. Similarly, so it's not only what CHP voters think about the foreign policy issue that impacts what position CHP takes on that issue. Actually, CHP's position also impacts. So this is a two-way dynamic that we see here. But I mean, so we have a situation in which voters of the ruling alliance are happy with Turkey using military force out of the country to protect Turkey's interests. There is no significant opposition from their own voters. Having said this, when you ask the question, when you present an option, how is peace best secured? Through military force or through negotiations? Voters of all political parties, with the exception of MHP, tend to say diplomacy. Now, MHP is an interesting case here. So they say, let's go to war regardless. But it's an outlier here on this issue. Otherwise, actually, the Turkish public prefers diplomacy to war, so long as it's securing peace and also Turkey's interests. Then there's the question of where Turkey should focus. Should Turkey play an active role in the Middle East, Balkans, and Central Asia, as it is doing now? Or should Turkey first handle her domestic issues? First of all, in general, in total, actually a majority of Turkish citizens say basically we should put our own house in order. But of course, in the case of, again, the parties of the ruling alliance, the AK party and the MHP, they think that Turkey should play an active role in the Middle East, Balkans, and Central Asia. I don't know if he is with us today, but Galip Dalay has written an excellent piece in Turkish, unfortunately, but he committed to writing one in English for GMF, and there he used Turkey's imperial ego. He did not actually say Turkey's imperial ego. He used imperial ego in general because Turkey is not the only post-empire. But he said Turkey still actually, is under the impact of such an ego. So the Turkish citizens actually seek grandeur and they expect their governments to provide grandeur to them. But it seems that in the case of the opposition parties, at least, the Turkish citizens don't see military interventions as the only source of grandeur. This actually gives the opposition parties space, as Galip has suggested, to provide grandeur in other means that are less controversial. Now, I have several slides on Turkish perceptions towards the European Union. The first one is related to the chosen trauma that I mentioned to you before starting the presentation. So basically, the question is, please tell me if you agree or disagree with the following statement. The statement being European countries want to disintegrate Turkey as they did to the Ottoman Empire in the past. I mean, you see that with the exception of HDP, which is Turkey's pro-Kurdish party, all party voters, almost with identical responses, agree that European countries want to disintegrate Turkey. The HDP voters may have their own reasons for not believing this, basically because the party is also accused for trying to disintegrate Turkey, so they might even have taken offense with this. So, another question, Europe has assisted separationist organizations like the PKK to get stronger in Turkey. A similar result, a similar response, even stronger, actually, again, with the exception of HDP voters. The reforms suggested by the European Union from Turkey are similar to those requested by the Treaty of Sevres. Again, like 58% of the total, and then with the exception of HDP, numbers, very high numbers, agree with this statement, when the reality is actually that the Sevres Treaty had nothing to do with reforms. It was about just, it was about who would be sovereign on which territory. And then, this is maybe the most interesting one. Crusader spirit underlines the attitude of Europe to Turkey. Again, like in total, 66%, and with the exception of HDP, there is not too big differences between different party voters. Now, so you see, I mean, in all respects, Turks don't have faith. They don't trust the European Union. They think that the European Union wants to do bad things to Turkey. They almost see the European Union as an enemy. So do you think they would like Turkey to be a member of the EU? They actually do. I mean, a plurality of 49% wants Turkey to be a member of the EU. So they would vote yes if there was a referendum this Sunday. Moreover, there is actually a big difference between the parties of the governing alliance and opposition parties. So if you look at the AK party at the very top, an equal number of AK party voters have said yes and no. So the AK party voter base is not really decided on this issue. If you look at MHP, there is a very clear no, with 50%, more than 50% saying that they would vote negative. If you look at the other parties, I mean, like CHP voters, 64% say yes. HDP voters, 62% say yes. E party, the good party voters, 52% say yes. So this is an issue that is dividing, that is in which political parties differentiate. But let me say this. In Turkey, the European Union is always doing the same thing. I mean, they're supporting minority groups, including political minority groups, and also political parties that feel vulnerable. I remember when the AK party was recently founded in the early 2000s, the AK party voters were much more pro-EU than CHP voters because they thought that their party was vulnerable and the EU was actually helping their party. So this is a domestic political issue as much as a foreign policy issue. But the thing is, so that negativity towards the European Union does not reflect as lack of desire to become a member of the EU. If we look at the generational aspect, we see here another thing, the 18 to 24 bracket. So I would actually encourage everyone studying Turkey, trying to understand Turkish public opinion, to take a closer look at this age bracket, because they seem to have different attitudes on all issues. But here we see that actually when actually the average is 48.9% for supporting EU membership, in this age bracket is 54.5. So there is a significant difference. So the upcoming generation seems to be more pro-EU than the former generations. But of course, how likely is it that Turkey will become a member to the European Union? 46% says Turkey will never be a member of the EU, And, you know, something that's actually close to it, like 40% or slightly less, think that Turkey will become a member sometime in the upcoming 15 years. So although this looks like pessimism, with, you know, 46% saying Turkey will never become a member of the EU, there is a significant population that I find very optimistic, actually. I hope they're true. I hope they're right. So now we come to the partners and sources of threat. So here you see attitudes of Turkish citizens towards different countries. The red means I have a negative attitude. It's written here politely, by not positive, but it means negative. So Turkish citizens have a very strong positive attitude towards Azerbaijan, and negative attitudes at varying degrees towards others. Well, it's the same thing. I mean, the chosen trauma, distrust, and then attitudes. Of course, you see Israel, United States, and Greece at the top of the list. Saudi Arabia is, of course, a recent member of this list, but one of the important members. Then you see Germany, for example. We could have, if we had more time, we could discuss why Germany is less dislikable than the United States. You know, Turkish families living there, football, trade relations, I don't know, but there is something there. Then we ask the question, which country is Turkey's most important partner? Again, Azerbaijan is the uncontested winner here. So 49% of Turks believe that Azerbaijan is Turkey's most important partner. Then comes the Russian Federation. Interestingly, look, Pakistan is very interesting. It's part of it is traditional thinking, but part of it is actually this trilateral relationship that is developing between Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Pakistan. Now, what's important is actually there are, of course, now the Azerbaijan being the most important partner overclouds, overshadows all of the differences between different political party voters because the numbers are so small. But there are actually significant differences. For example, CHP and E Party, CHP and E Party, two opposition parties seem to vote the highest for Russia being Turkey's most important partner, when you would expect this from AK party voters. But this is not the case. So this is just, you know, this is just public opinion on foreign policy. It does not represent the policies of the Turkish Republic or policies of the parties. But there's something that I say quite often. When there is a change of government in Turkey, don't expect a reversal of foreign policy and expect lots of continuity. So, you know, the fact that public opinion is almost uniform here, I think supports this point. Then we ask the question, which country poses biggest threat to Turkey? Surprisingly or unsurprisingly, it's the United States of America, followed by Israel, followed by Greece. France is a new addition to this list, but an important one. It goes on and on. So, of course, this is a troubling outcome because Turkey is a NATO member. And then Turkey sees NATO allies as the biggest threat. The Turkish public sees the NATO allies as the biggest threat to Turkey. Whichever direction you look at this, I think this is troubling. This is something that we need to talk about. Then the question is, which of the following do you think Turkey should cooperate with on international issues? Here I chose to share, because there are not too many differences between political parties, I chose to share the age brackets. You see, first of all, in general, the European Union comes up quite high on the list. After, let's say, for example, if you look at 25-34 bracket, you see Russia quite strong, none of the above, etc. But in the younger brackets, 18 to 24 and 24 to 30, 25 to 34, you see the EU coming up very high. So again, this again proves the point that younger generations, for one reason or another, it may be related to the youth unemployment in Turkey, I don't know, but they seem to be more pro-European, not more pro-American, or not necessarily pro-transatlantic, but definitely more pro-European than the former generations. Then there is this, I think, very important question of should Turkey improve her relations with Russia, even if this deteriorates relations with the allies. Here, the respondents are almost being forced to make a choice. And they agree that Turkey should improve her relations with Russia, even if this deteriorates relations with the allies. Let's see if the opposition parties agree with this policy, because this is the policy of the existing government, sitting president in Turkey, improving relations with Russia, even if this deteriorates relations with traditional allies. CHP voters seem to agree. HDP voters seem to agree. And Good Party, E-Party voters seem to agree. So the opposition parties' voters don't necessarily disagree with the current policy, although it was developed and implemented by President Erdogan. Then we ask the question, okay, but to what extent Turkey's relations with NATO are important for Turkey's security? 58% say it's important, it's somewhat important or very important, as opposed to only 28% who say that it's not important. Again, I mean, this is very interesting because Turkey does not, the respondents did not count any NATO ally among Turkey's friends, partners, and counted a lot of them among Turkey's adversaries, but they still think that NATO is important for Turkey. So here, I would argue that there is a stark difference between the ideational opinion in Turkey and the realistic approach in Turkey. When you think along ideational lines, you may choose to see the West not as a friend, but when you think along realistic lines, you don't seem to have an option. So this is the end of my presentation. I mean, of course we had a lot of other findings, but I wanted to use time efficiently. So I think these were the findings that tell my story the best.
Thank you so much, Özgür. Thank you. I will come back to you, but I want to bring in Dorothée rapidly. Dorothée, now I would like to have your thought on Turkish public opinion on foreign policy, given the results that Özgür has just presented. But please, you don't limit yourself to this survey or what Özgür presented. So what would be the implication of these results also for the Turkish foreign policy and Turkey's relation with the West? I would like to have your thought on that, and particularly implication for the EU-Turkey relations. Over to you.
Okay, bonjour, hello everybody. Happy New Year to all of those to whom I haven't been speaking to up to now. Thanks a lot, Özgür, for your presentation. Do you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, fine. So I'll make a few general comments on the whole research, on the survey. I've been going through the rest of the research. I think it's important because here we're discussing the link, in fact, between the political, ideological landscape and foreign policy opinions of the Turks. So I think it's also very telling to go through the rest of the study. I don't want to dwell on it, but I found that some aspects in the construction, the methodology of the study were very interesting, like focusing on the parties, the way it's done, and the result the survey gives in terms of the obsession with community and shrinking communities, I'd say, in Turkey, mistrust within the Turkish society itself, actually draws a sort of totalitarian landscape, I'd say, because there's one point where one of the questions, one of the conclusions you draw from the set of questions is that people do align actually on the opinions of the political parties. They believe that their community, one important community for them is the political party. And we also see that the Turks share a sense of paranoia. They don't believe in anyone outside of Turkey. They don't trust anyone. We know that's a historical, trend. That's how the Turks are bred, arguably. And so here, when you find Azerbaijan as the main partner, this is actually no surprise, but it always looks a little strange, of course, seen from the outside, because Azerbaijan is, of course, a grand friend of Turkey, but it's a small country. So there is this sense of political alignment, paranoia, and pessimism aligned to a high level of nationalism. There's a sense of hyper-nationalism going through the questions on the domestic part of the survey. So I think this is very important. Also, another thing that I was very much focusing on was the answers from the supporters of the EE party, because we don't know this party at all. And it looks very, very strange, actually, if you put together the small parts, like it's the only non-entirely predictable, I'd say, part of the Turkish electorate, but maybe because it's not very consistent yet. But for the rest, you'd see that the rest just falls in line with the idea of what we have of the Turkish society, more or less. But it's becoming more and more of an entrenched sort of a caricatural landscape. And a last remark on the domestic part is that I noted that in some of the questions relating to the values equates to religion. And I think that's very important, because this is actually, when me reading this as a French person, like coming from a very secular country where we have a sort of immediate distance with all religious values and the way they mix with the political ones, it looks very strange to see that religion still takes such an important place in the framing of the ideological positions of the people in Turkey. And I think maybe this could have been actually re-injected in the foreign policy part. I think that maybe there's something missing about religious alignment internationally and how the Turks see the Muslim community in the international sphere. Now, if we come to just Özgür's presentation and the results he's been trying to synthesize, I say that the first thing that strikes me is there seems to be a sort of international awareness of the Turks that goes, I'd say, beyond what we have here in Europe. And this shows that, to me, I think this shows that actually international policies and the foreign policy of Turkey has been used as a domestic instrument. It's an important channel for the government to talk to its electorate. So you need to keep the Turks alert on what's going on internationally and on the making of friends and enemies, etc. It's an important part of how they see themselves. So they probably look, at least seen from this study, they look more interested in foreign policy than many Western liberal democracy citizens. But it's not necessarily very rational or articulate. So there's a big interest, but it's extremely contradictory from within the survey. So how far can this be considered a progress? If you see that people do care for what's going on internationally, for their external relations of their country, but then if you go into the details, you fall on completely contradictory, irrational opinions at some points. Then if you go to the specific opinions expressed, of course, I know, Kadri, you'd like me to comment more on the EU. Well, I think it's only quite classical that we see that the EU has become sort of, just like the Turkish government says, actually, it has become a strategic issue. It's not an issue for the Turks of belonging. It's not that they feel they're being repelled, chased outside of the European zone, etc. They just think that the EU is something different from them completely, and we're sort of drowning into the sea of distrust that I was mentioning earlier. And what really matters to me is that I see that the learning process regarding the EU is less and less working. The Turks are not interested into the EU anymore, I'd say. There's a sort of re-estrangement. And that's a problem because every country, that's a problem if you think in terms of EU accession, of course, because all of the countries who've gone through this sometimes very long transition period towards joining the EU have to go through a sort of appropriation, ownership process, and which goes through a learning process. Myself being a French EU citizen, having done my PhD on EU foreign policy, I still have to sort of revise every day to understand what's going on in the EU. So if you're not interested, if you're not motivated, if you don't care for what the EU is, then you get, I'd say, automatically estranged because you don't understand how it works. And I think this is very important that the EU is sort of now considered as not even an equal element in the external environment of Turkey, but it's a second-range element, I'd say. So it means that, in fact, the rapprochement process is completely lost, I'd say, now. Then there's a question I'd like to ask Özgür, which is the Sèvres syndrome expression, is it still derogatory in Turkish, or is it completely mainstream? Like, do you think it's positive, it's negative? Because actually it relates to a sort of, we consider it as a psychiatric, affection. It's a disease. This is the Sèvres syndrome. It's not only the description of a normal mind attitude. It has been described as a sort of a perversion of the mind, a historical misperception of reality that's building up into a psychiatric syndrome currently. So I'd like to know if now the Sèvres syndrome is being sort of completely reversed into actually something positive that the Turks would pride themselves on in a reconstruction of the national narrative that is becoming absolutely that's completely at odds with the construction of the EU narrative, or the common European narrative at large. Then, of course, as being in Paris, I was very interested in how France was treated, which is extremely marginal in the survey, of course. But what I realized is that we're not a partner. And this is very disappointing to us because Tayyip Erdogan has recently extended a hand to the French to mend the relationship. But we don't rank high in the priorities of Turkey at all. Germany is the one who's taking it all. And if you see the world and if you see how the EU works from the French standpoint, of course, the Turks are wrong to rely on the Germans to obtain everything from the EU, because everything that's political so far is coming more from the French. Historically, that's how it's worked. Of course, now we're going through a sort of rebalancing because Germany is taking more international responsibilities. But still, Macron is the super pro-European, proactive president who, he has like 4 advisors for the EU only in his diplomatic team. That's quasi half of the advisors he has. So we are a very important player within the EU. So probably this goes to what I said earlier with the complete disinterest in the EU that the Turks had. But then talking to my German counterparts this week, like we discussed here and there, what's being seen as a new attitude from Erdogan, who wants to, start the new year with the good intentions and let's forget the past and start a new positive base and become the best of partners again. I see that this sea of distrust that we had in Turkey has now extended to Europe. Like nobody believes the Turkish president, when he says he has good intentions now. There's not only skepticism, there is an extremely negative attitude. And I don't know how long it would take to reverse this, of course. And then my last remark would probably be that I see a sort of hyper representation of Russia in the landscape. But this is also how we Westerners see Turkey. We're obsessed with the Turkey-Russia relations. And I think we'll now come to a situation where both countries are more or less neutralizing each other to a certain point. So I would probably be less worried about what's brewing between Turkey and Russia. But this seems to be the only place where you have dynamic developments now. I suppose this is why we're all obsessed with this, because it's the only completely new, if you want, element in the whole way the Turks see their international environment. So to make it short, I see only reasons for the Europeans to be, of course, pessimistic. Rather classical depiction of how the Turkish international mindset, but still the new directions, the new signals that we have are not especially positive to imagine for a better relationship and a more effective partnership in the future. I stop there.
Merci beaucoup, Dorothée. Thank you. It was great. Nick, please, I would love to have also your thought on these figures, but as a historian, you can also give a historical background, if you wish, how the attitude of Turkey toward the West evolved, and especially your thought on the application for the US-Turkey relations. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on here. It's a pleasure to be back, if only virtually, with all of my GMF colleagues. Let me begin by encouraging people to read the entire presentation. There's the stuff on foreign policy is fascinating, but there's also an amazing amount of fascinating research about Turkish public opinion writ large. As people who've read other GMF publications on this have seen, the extent of polarization really is shocking. It's not, everything. There's, I think the most consensus on any issue was the fear of earthquakes, which was almost unanimous. I certainly understand that. Looking from the United States, the fact that over, I think, 90% of people even just claimed they were abiding by basic coronavirus protection measures was also a remarkable show of unanimity. But beyond a few basic things like this, indeed, public opinion is shockingly polarized. One of the most striking conclusions in the report as a whole was that even the existence of polarization is polarized. There was a question, some people think that differences of opinion and behavior have increased in Turkey. And you have a very large number of opposition, CHP and İYİ Party people saying that they have, and the pro-government alliance, the AKP and the MHP, denying that this kind of polarization exists. Which is particularly ironic backdrop when you get to foreign policy. Because where you have this dynamic where the opposition is saying the country as a whole has become more polarized, the government is saying that the country as a whole was unified against the marginal opposition, you have the government attacking the opposition for undermining it or not supporting it on foreign policy issues, undermining it in its relations with the West. Erdogan made this criticism quite pointedly against the CHP when the S-400 sanctions were released. And yet, as in fact the data that we've just heard shows, when it comes to foreign policy and particularly attitudes towards the West, the opposition has actually been very supportive of the government, and if not always particularly of the government, certainly supportive of the government's worldview. They certainly share a lot of the concerns that the government has and the government claims to be operating on in its relations with the West. I'd even take this one step further. There certainly is disagreement in between the opposition and the government about specific foreign policies. This survey asked about Libya in particular. where you see that there is much higher support from the AKP and the MHP for Turkey's involvement in Libya than amongst the opposition. What's worrying from the perspective of people in Brussels and Washington is that you actually tend to see more consensus, and I'm doing this trying to compare these survey results to some other survey results I've seen. You actually seem to see more consensus on the issues where Turkey's behavior is most alarming to the US and the EU. So for example, while Libya or Turkey's conflict with Russia and Syria and Idlib there is some real difference when it comes to things like Turkey's policy in northeast Syria, confronting US-backed YPG forces, or Turkey's confrontation with Greece in the Eastern Med. You actually see a much greater consensus behind the government. I was also struck that in the survey results about support for the government's decision to turn Hagia Sophia into a mosque, you obviously saw high 80s support from the AKP and the MHP, but still pretty high support from the opposition. 50% support from EE party, 45% from HDP, and even in the CHP, 35%. And in light of the conversation about the Sev syndrome, I thought this was interesting, precisely because Erdogan framed in his rhetoric the decision about Hagia Sophia not just as being about religion, not just as being about a mosque, but about national sovereignty, about this being as much about Turkey's right to do this in the face of international opposition as the decision itself. And so I mentioned that as another data point for showing that even policies about which there are disagreement when they're framed in national security terms, can actually, the government's rhetoric in framing can be effective. So what does this mean? Maybe these observations are somewhat obvious, but for what they're worth, the extent of the anti-Western, not just hostility, but really fear and suspicion makes cooperation more difficult, even when there is very good national security reason for it, even when there is common geopolitical ground. This is also something GMF has done a lot of great work on. Özgür hosted an event a little while ago about looking at the many shared interests the US and Turkey have. And indeed, as there have been for 70 years, there continue to be very strong and compelling reasons for both sides to continue to work together. The challenge is how to do this when the sides increasingly see their interest in thwarting one another, see their interest in working against the other as being more compelling in itself than their interest in advancing the goals that they share. And I obviously don't have an answer to this. I'm phrasing this as a question, but you see some really discouraging situations where there are clear grounds to work together, and yet in the current political climate, it seems impossible to realize. In Syria, for example, if you had a more rational US-Turkish relationship, you could imagine you can imagine the two countries making common cause, helping Turkey push back against Russia and Syria in Idlib, in return for Turkey supporting US efforts to keep Russia and Syria out of northeastern Syria. Ultimately moving towards a compromise where both Idlib and Rojava get some kind of autonomy, and that's used to constrain the power of the Assad regime and the influence of Russia in the region. Obviously, this is going to be impossible when the Turkish government, fairly or not, sees the YPG as a major existential threat. And it's going to be difficult when increasingly people in Washington don't seem to mind seeing Russia and Assad militarily push back the Turkish forces in Idlib. Another example of this, the situation in Xinjiang. Clearly, the United States and Turkey ideally would be working together to prevent China from committing genocide against the Uyghur population there. But unfortunately, when US-Turkish tensions leave Turkey facing US government sanctions, leave Ankara convinced that it needs China as a necessary partner to maintain its economy in the face of these sanctions, this kind of cooperation is really difficult. And the worst, obviously, it leads into these conspiracy theories, which people have heard, in which the existence of China's genocidal policies is even seen by some nationalists as an American conspiracy designed to undermine Turkish-Chinese cooperation. Again, I don't have great solutions, but it's worth restating the extent to which, the hostility and the suspicion in itself prevent what could be very necessary forms of cooperation. Also, I think it's worth parsing, maybe in trying to figure out how to deal with this, the fact that there is a distinction between two kind of versions of Turkish foreign policy we've seen. And this is also something I wrote about for GMF. There's a kind of more realist version of what Turkey's doing now, where it's focusing on Turkey's opportunities in its region, focusing on the shifting global balance of power, and saying that in light of this, Turkey should pursue a more independent foreign policy in which it tries to balance its relations with the US and Europe with Russia, China, and take a more prominent role in its region. And this overlaps a lot, but I think is different from the sort of more paranoid version that the US and Europe are threats that Turkey has to work to counter. And so it plays out in how these two views look at how US policy fits into this. And so people who focus on the idea that Turkey is pursuing a more independent foreign policy in a changing world, I think can convincingly argue that this is a rational response to a degree of US retrenchment. US is less active in the region. That creates opportunities for Turkey to take a greater role. The paranoid version, ironically, actually doesn't really fit with the idea of US retrenchment. Some of the things that people who see the US as a threat are most inclined to cite, I would argue, are responses to continued or US activism. So the presence of US forces backing the YPG in Syria, this is something, Trump tried to withdraw those forces. The Biden administration may well double down on that policy. That's a situation where it's not as much US retrenchment, but the US presence in the region that's fueling Turkish foreign policy. Similarly, the CAATSA sanctions were driven by traditional American bipartisan desire to push back against Russia, to maintain our kind of global standing in the face of a resurgent Russian government. So I just say, depending on which version of this Turkish foreign policy you focus on, whether it's US retrenchment or continued activism that's driving it and will exacerbate it, is connected. I think there's also an interesting idea that I've heard some people suggest, that the overly hostile approach driven by the sense of the US as a threat actually compromises what in other cases could be a more calculated, realist effort to increase Turkey's independence vis-a-vis the United States. So people have suggested if Ankara was going to pick a fight with Washington over buying Russian weapons, they could have found a better, more strategic weapons system to choose than the S-400. Similarly, based on what I've seen in Washington, I think you could argue, without some of the gratuitous things Turkey's done to alienate Washington, without arresting Andrew Brunson, without beating up protesters in Sheridan Circle, you'd actually have a lot less pushback from DC to the kind of strategically frustrating choices Turkey's made. It would have taken a lot longer for Congress to get to the point of wanting to sanction Turkey over the S-400s if it hadn't been for things like Brunson in the Sheridan Circle. And I think this is interesting, and it gets to the question that Özgür raised about how policy might change if the opposition came to power. And I think sometimes you have the opposition suggesting that, what they would do is actually simply take a smarter approach to pursuing a more independent foreign policy on Turkey's part. And, they've said, and I think this is pretty convincing, that without gratuitously alienating not just Washington, but some regional countries like Israel and Egypt, Turkey would actually have a stronger position in its Eastern Mediterranean dispute with Greece. So from Washington's point of view, I think you can see both sides of that. I mean, you can see, on one hand, the risk that if the opposition came to power, Turkey would be more effective in pursuing an independent foreign policy as a problem. On the other hand, you could see if what you're concerned about isn't Turkey pursuing a more independent foreign policy, but Turkey pursuing an aggressively anti-Western foreign policy, then you could actually see, a Turkish opposition that pursued a more effective independent foreign policy. It wouldn't necessarily be what Washington wanted, but compared to the foreign policy that it looks like what the United States is going to get from Erdogan in the foreseeable future, and you certainly make the case it's preferable. So with that, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to talk more about history and instead speculated wildly and irresponsibly about the future. But I hope in the questions we can get back to the past.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nick. That's great. Before bringing the audience question, Özgür, I wanted to bring Dorothee's question on this, on how so-called server syndrome is used also in the reconstruction of the national narrative or grandeur, etc. You can maybe answer this quickly, but I have also a question on how much do you think this picture, this picture that you have presented is affecting decision-making on the foreign policy issue in Turkey? Then we can bring the question from the audience.
Thank you, Kadri. To Dorothee's question, so it's called SER syndrome, it's called SER trauma, it's called SER paranoia, and you said it's an unhealthy way of thinking, but what kind of a healthy way of thinking can we find that would suggest that European countries have a plan to revive the SER treaty? It's not healthy. So the name may be derogatory, but this is a problem. The SER treaty was a reality. The way that the Ottoman Empire was treated was a reality. But then, thinking that 100 years later, the same thing is going to happen all over again is a problem. So second, to Kadri's question, Kadri, that's a very good chicken and egg question. So does public opinion drive foreign policy or the official policy drive public opinion? Now, in the past, I would have said it's the latter. In the past, I would have said, well, actually, public opinion doesn't matter in foreign policy formulation. And on the contrary, people listen to their leaders and then make their decisions. But increasingly, public opinion now also matters. But still, there are other factors, as I said in the beginning. Like assessment of national interest, assessment of threats, assessment of let's say what others think, the international system, ideational factors. And as a matter of fact, if you want to analyze what drives Erdogan's foreign policy in each and every case, you cannot come to the same conclusion. In some cases, it will be ideational factors. In some cases, it will be his assessment of national interest. In some limited cases, public opinion may also be playing a role.
Thank you, Özgür. Well,
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add this on the subject of the SEV syndrome. The flip side is as bad as, or as much as, there's been criticism of the SEV syndrome. The positive side of it was that it was embedded in a historical narrative that foreign countries had tried to break up Turkey. Turkey defeated their efforts, and now Turkey had borders that it was happy with, that it would defend at all costs. And it, to some extent, at least that matter was settled. I think what's alarming people now watching is what I've heard some Greek colleagues refer to as the Lausanne syndrome, which is that now, instead of seeing SEV as an attempt to break up Turkey that's been defeated, there's this growing sense that even the Lausanne, which is formally celebrated as the achievement of Turkey's justifiable borders, was in some sense unfair, in some sense left Turkey with too little. And I know, I don't want to kind of overstate the extent of this thinking within Turkey, but even these small rhetorical hints of irredentism, I think I'm always struck talking to people from neighboring countries around Turkey, the extent to which even these rhetorical hints really, create a great deal of alarm and create a kind of growing sense of, if the SEV syndrome is an internal issue for Turkey, they create a growing threat that actually this has now become a psychological issue that threatens Turkey's neighbors.
Thank you, Nick. Dorothée, if you don't have something to say at that now, that I will bring the questions. The first question is from Güney Yıldız. Özgür, is for you. In fact, their voting behavior, or this is a secondary issue to others that you do not necessarily change how people vote?
Kadri, thank you very much. I will answer the question, but if Dorothée and Nick also want to weigh in, please do so. I think this is a secondary issue. I think this does not bring new voters to Erdogan's alliance, but I think it consolidates his existing voters. this is something that he's presenting them with, and does have an impact, but not as much as other issues.
Thank you. Dorothée, would you like to add something on that, or Nick? No. Well, I bring another question. So, any insight are from Rachel Eleus? I hope that I'm pronouncing well. Any insight are to what lies behind Turkey's views on who their most important partners are? Is it based on fact or emotion? What's your take on that?
I mean, my take is it's a mix of different factors. First of all, there's a lot of emotion in there. We all think that we take decisions rationally. As a matter of fact, for all of us, we take decisions more emotionally than rationally. So emotions certainly play a role. Recent developments play a role. And then what people hear from their leaders, what they hear on the television also play a role. And then even look, this is a growing factor, which is the TV series. I mean, in Turkey, TV series are used to actually manipulate public opinion on a whole host of domestic and foreign policy issues. You can take a historical era, then place the current era in that historical era, as we see in many historical dramas, and then make public opinion about current events depending on what people are expected to assume happened 1,000 years ago. So all of these actually play a role.
Nick or Dorothée, would you like to add something? If not, I have other.
I mean, I don't have a great answer. I think a colleague put it well. They were like, the mystery isn't that everyone in Turkey thinks the United States is supporting Kurdish separatism when the United States is obviously supporting Kurdish separatism. The issue is that everyone in Turkey thought that when the United States was still helping Turkey fight against Kurdish separatism. I mean, that's sort of the paradox to me. You look at a lot of what's happening now, and the Turkish threat perceptions, you can see where they're coming from. And yet what's weird is they preceded a lot of the specific foreign policy issues that Turks cite as evidence of them. So in that sense, I really don't know.
Dorothée?
Yes, there was just one point about, I mentioned that Germany featured into the list of the important partners and not France. I think there are two sides to this. Probably one is that there's awareness from the Turkish public that Germany is a very important economic partner. And so I think this is in line with the actually domestic part of the survey, which shows a lot of concern about the economic situation of Turkey. And there's a very sophisticated framework of the survey on the economic side and the situation, the microeconomics of Turkey, I'd say. So I think this makes a realistic, actually, assessment for the Turks. To a certain point, Germany matters really more to the Turks. It does affect more the daily lives of the citizens of Turkey than do the very aggressive rhetoric between Macron and Erdogan.
Thank you, Dorothée. A question from an anonymous participant. What are the expectations of the panelists in terms of information operations, disinformation by Turkish actor in the context of this hostile attitude, mistrust vis-a-vis foreign actors? Is it easy for them to mobilize the communication activity to amplify that mistrust? For instance, also among Turkish diaspora? Dorothée, I know that you have to leave earlier because the curfew will start at 6 in Paris today.
Tomorrow, but today we have to prepare for the curfew at 6 tomorrow. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's tomorrow.
And I know that you have to leave earlier, right?
Are we worried that the Turkish government can actually manipulate this, the results of the survey, can sort of use this very sophisticated data that we have on the Turkish mindset about international relations. Well, of course, I think this probably relates to what I tried to say in my introduction. Looking at the survey, I thought that this gave, I said, a very totalitarian picture of what's becoming of Turkey currently. Like these small communities of individuals who feel more and more isolated, who don't trust anybody except their family, close friends, and the party. So they have a political community. Okay, you have several parties, but there's one big dominant party, and they align with this big organizational frame to determine what they think, and they don't have freedom of thinking up to a certain point. And of course, in that sort of context, the social networks have a very ambivalent part to play, because they can be considered as a tool for democracy, because everybody can express themselves publicly. But if they're controlled, which is actually what's the path that Erdogan is taking now, their control, and if they're being used by the government massively to engineer the way the people think, then it's becoming very dangerous. And there is a great, there's more and more worries here, clearly in Europe, seeing that the Turkish diaspora is becoming part of this totalitarian landscape that I was describing. Like they are aligning along both the line of the party and a very nationalistic attitude. They would at the same time behave as Turks in a very paranoid way, with the whole definition of the enmity that's global, and you can never trust anyone except the Azerbaijanis neighbors. And then you have to rely on the AK party to give the direction. So this is, I would say, probably this is what differentiates actually the new political sociology in Turkey and the one inside the EU, where you have an enormous distrust in political parties. This is also why I found so exotic, this survey, probably because here I don't think we really find that the polls and surveys who do express the views of the voters of some specific political communities or parties do give an assessment of reality, of the social realities of the countries. The people are more and more disconnected from the parties, and they're very difficult to, it's very difficult to seize the collective mood.
Thank you, Dorothée. Özgür or Nick, if you don't have something to add. The following question is on the gender issue, Özgür, from Marion Böker. Why you ask 49% women and 51% men?
I checked this after Marion actually posted the question. According to Turkish Statistics Bureau, I don't know why this is the case, but it seems that the ratio of women in Turkey is slightly lower, like 49.5, compared to the ratio of men, which is 50.5. And this is the overall population. So I don't know the situation in the adult population, but it certainly is not the case that in Turkey, women's population is 52% of the total.
Thanks, Özgür. Question from Alan Makowski. In every survey, it says the US and Israel are named the top two threats. How would you define the nature of these perceived threats? Military, political, economic?
Is it to me, Kadri?
Let me start. You can answer.
I'm sure that Ellen can answer this question much better than I can. But my take is that actually, in the case of the United States, it's actually all of the above. and mainly political and military, if not directly to Turkey, hurting Turkey's interests with interventions in Turkey's neighboring countries. Also, let's not forget that in the inner circles of the AK party, there is a very strong belief that the United States wants to remove President Erdogan from power using legitimate or illegitimate means. So, that's a very strong belief that you have there. So I guess that's the political side. With Israel, it's more interesting. I think it's a way of saying we don't like Israel. I think it's more conspiratorial because, or let's say more covert slash conspiratorial, because there is no visible threat coming from Israel to Turkey.
Thank you, Özgür. A question from Andre Finkel. Do the attitude reflected in this survey reflect the presentation of these issues in Turkish media, or are they deep-seated and immutable? In other words, could they change tomorrow if the government gave a different signal?
Kadri, if I may say, Ambassador Selim Yenel actually asked a similar question. So trust or distrust towards France and Germany may be based on the leaders rather than the countries. Would Turkey continue to trust Germany as much after Merkel leaves power? Definitely. I mean, there are factors that actually change perceptions of the Turkish society. Recent political developments, the leaders who represent nations, etc., etc. But in many cases, actually, the change is not radical. For example, I can tell you that what I call the say trauma or paranoia, whatever, has been very consistent in Turkey for decades. And in the case of Germany, for example, it's very interesting. I remember being part of a survey 15 years ago, and then Germany was again the most trusted and most liked, actually, or least disliked European nation, according to the Turkish public. And we had discussed why this is the case. And somebody had said, maybe it's because Germany is very successful in football. And I had thought, there may be something in it. But then, of course, economic cooperation, Turkish families in Germany, etc. So even when Chancellor Merkel leaves, I think this could change. For example, the trust and liking towards Germany could decrease a little bit, but I believe not fundamentally. So similarly, in your question, I mean, does what the Turkish people hear from their leadership impact their opinion? Definitely. Does what they read on the newspapers, what they see on the television impact their view? Definitely. If they heard different narratives, if they heard and saw different things on the TV and radio and newspapers, would their responses change? Probably, but I believe not fundamentally. So there is a fundamental distrust towards the West that you see there. I have been, observing such surveys for a very long time. Although there are shifts, the shifts are never dramatic. The most important shift is Russia, I must say. Russia be turning into a potential partner from the principal enemy in almost less than a decade is very interesting to watch. But also, let's not forget, everything is not about perceptions. I mean, it happens to be the reality that Russia has been helpful to Turkey on what the Turkish society believes is the most important threat to Turkey. Others were not helpful. Russia was helpful. So I think that the Turkish public did not miss the fact that President Putin was the first foreign leader to show solidarity with the elected Turkish government on the night of the failed coup attempt. So these things also. So we should not think that all perceptions are just falsely based, etc. And all of these actually influence what people think.
Thank you, Özgür. I should may also add the education system, because it's also playing probably and adding a lot to this kind of narratives, let's say. Dorothée, I know that it's time for you to leave, and if you want to say something before leaving.
I want to say goodbye and good luck to everyone. And I think it was a very good conversation to start the year.
Thank you so much.
We're going into more and more sophistication, and that's good. So, à bientôt. Bye-bye. See you.
Thank you, Dorothée.
Bye-bye, Dorothée.
Oh. Well, and another question I'm bringing from a journalist from Bulgaria, Angel Petrov, is asking Özgür to you. The HDP voters' answer seems to diverge from other parties on such issues, be as the use of military or perception of what the EU is doing, etc. But not radically so. Despite the mistrust between HDP and the Turkish states over the past years, what's your take on that?
Well, it's a good question. I think, however, I would say that even if they don't differ radically, I think on some issues they differ very substantially. So it's a good thing that they don't differ radically, but it should not be overlooked. In cases like, using the military outside of the country, trusting European Union, preferring diplomacy over let's say using the military, I mean, on all of those issues, or like on Europeans wanting to disintegrate Turkey, Europeans supporting the PKK, and also on questions that are not here, actually HDP voters substantially differ from the rest. And then, of course, I mean, they are also citizens of this country. They have also grown up in this country. They come from a similar or even the same, let's say, historical, cultural background. So I think it's natural that they don't differ radically.
Thank you. Another question from Sinemadar. How does one reconcile the decreasing vote share of the AKP-MHP in the latest polls with the observation that the AKP seem to have successfully created a community of loyalists?
Well, I mean, in Sinem's question, there are two assumptions. I mean, both of these are assumptions. We are not in an election cycle, and I usually don't trust election questions when we are not in an election cycle. So it's an assumption that votes of AK Party and MHP are decreasing, but we do not know. And second, they could still create a group of loyalists and still lose voters in the wider population, which I believe is the case.
Barçın Yunan's question is, she's saying that the Sever syndrome is not an AKP phenomenon. Won't you think is it just instrumentalized better by AKP?
Nick, please do weigh in when you want to. I think it's
absolutely.
Instrumentalized by everyone. It's not. I mean, I remember former governments also instrumentalizing this. So that the West wants to disintegrate Turkey is not used first by President Erdogan. I remember other political leaders using similar discourses.
Thank you. Another question from an anonymous participant. How malleable is Turkish public opinion on foreign security issues? Assuming he wants, Mr. President can make concession on the US on the S-400 issue without incurring major political costs?
Well, as malleable as other societies, and President Erdogan is as talented as other politicians in succeeding in this. If he wants to do this, and seriously, this is a very important question, by the way. So if President Erdogan decided to change course on the S-400s, would he be able to persuade his followers, or would he be able to just, let's say, take the risk? Well, he would need to create a narrative in which this is another success for Turkey. So if the United States wants to help President Erdogan change his approach to this question, then the United States needs to offer President Erdogan an off-ramp on this issue and present an honorable exit. It cannot be that President Erdogan is backing in front of US sanctions. He is not strong enough to resist them, so he's accepting the terms of the United States. So that won't be the solution. It must look like a success story.
Yeah. So Nick, this question I would like to bring you in.
Yeah, I'm eager to.
And then Özgür can also comment. What can the West do? I mean, realistically speaking, to improve the Turkish public's perception of the West? It's an anonymous participant asking this question.
I wanted to answer the previous question anyways, but especially since I don't have a good answer for this one, I'm definitely going to go back to the last one. Because this was a huge question for the reasons that were laid out in Washington, specifically about the S-400. You know, over the last couple of years, more than that, I feel like people have always been asking, you know, right, Erdogan may have been fanning the flames of anti-Westernism, but at what point does he actually become a prisoner to the rhetoric, to the emotions that existed before him, as we've heard, but also that he helped create? And exactly, the fear was that the S-400 would become one of those issues. You know, the positive side, it seems like for most of the last year, there was some kind of off-the-records compromise reached where, after testing the S-400s, not this past fall, but the fall before, Turkey was willing to warehouse them as part of a deal with various folks in Washington, and that kept the issue off the radar. And every once in a while, Turkey would say, we're going to test them again. No one in the Turkish public really seemed to be that upset or paying attention to what was going on. And it looked like it worked until all of a sudden, right before Biden got elected, Turkey tested them very publicly. And that made it seem like, you know, maybe this wasn't an effective strategy. So in that sense, I mean, I do think, you know, particularly at the moment now where Erdogan does seem like he's eager to calm relations with not just the US, but with some of Turkey's neighbors, the question of how much flexibility his own rhetoric has left him is very much, you know, in the fore. And I guess the lesson from the S-400 is, up to a point, he does have a lot of flexibility, but the rhetorical benefits he gets from continuing to use this rhetoric, it seems like create very difficult temptations to resist. What America can do to try to overcome this, I mean, in the long term, you know, continue working in a principled and non-hypocritical way to support democracy in Turkey and hope that in 20 years that strategy pays off.
Özgür. Thank you, Nick.
Kadri, I think I answered that question.
Okay, so the other question I wanted, but it's fine. What West could do, actually, it was the question. Another question, Özgür, on what outstanding issue do you think President Biden might make most progress with the President Erdogan?
I mean, here I actually have a view that's very different from actually the way the question is asked. I think that Turkey and the United States should change the way that they think of the relationship. Right now, we see this as a purely strategic relationship. And if we disagree on a number of issues, we think that this is unacceptable in a relationship like the one between Turkey and the United States. I think we should replace this with a mindsetting that as long as we are cooperating on a number of important issues, it's okay that we disagree on some others, but then we cannot leave those to autopilot either. We need to create crisis prevention mechanisms between the two countries. So, you know, to give you one example, I don't think that, you know, the core issue, maybe this was on the mind of the person asking the question, like, can Turkey and the United States really agree on armed Kurdish non-state actors, individuals? I don't see that happening in the short run, in the foreseeable future. But I can see Turkey and the United States reaching an agreement that would prevent this disagreement from turning into a crisis. So I think they should focus on such an approach.
Nick, if you want to answer this, but before I have a quick question for Özgür again. What do you think why Turkey has this such level of societal trust?
Oh, it's a very long question, of course. I mean, trust is accumulated after successful interactions between individuals. So Turkey probably does not provide its citizens with the opportunities to interact with each other that would lead to the accumulation of trust. The Turkish civil society is getting stronger, but is not as strong as it should be. Participation in civil society is not very high. Turkey is a society that's been formed by immigration. So migration coming from outside of Turkey to Turkey, and then migration within the country. So this always creates stress on society. So And then, of course, there is this top-down, very fast westernization that happened in less than a century, actually, which happened in a few decades. That has also caused to lack of trust between citizens. And then, of course, trust is decreasing everywhere, actually, in all societies. Look at what's happening in the United States currently.
Thank you. Nick, if you have something to add, a comment to do, is your last chance.
Oh, this is my last chance to... No, I just go back to what Özgür said before, and I think to the extent going forward, the United States and Turkey can bracket their differences rather than letting them get worse. And this goes for the EU too. You know, I think we have to take that as a win. And I mean, I agree on the S-400 issue, this isn't going to go away. This isn't going to get solved by a technical committee. But if we can get through the next couple of years without the United States imposing new sanctions, without Turkey rushing out to buy more Russian weapons, you know, that's great. Similarly on the Eastern Med, I mean, it looks like Greece and Turkey are sitting down for exploratory talks again. I don't think anyone thinks this is going to resolve the issue, but as long as people are having exploratory talks rather than, you know, engaging in saber rattling on the open seas, you know, again, that's, if we can sort of muddle through, I think that's great.
Thank you so much, Nick. Özgür, before closing, really quick answer, please, from Marion Böker about the survey. Foreign policy is in some region and subject and profession of increasing interest for young people. Did you ask how many tend to choose to study foreign policy or become foreign international relations or become a diplomat?
Unfortunately, we did not, because this was actually a survey on polarization. So that was not among the questions that we asked.
That's great, thank you. Well, let me to thank to all three of you, and Dorothée is not here, but for joining and making this conversation work. Really, thank you so much. It has been really terrific. Thank you, Özgür. Thank you, Nick.
Thank
you, Dorothée. She has already left. And let me thank also my colleague Anika and Zakari, who helped to put all of this together. And above all, thanks to all of you who have joined us. And thank you, and hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.